Hello and welcome back to Dev Game Club. Oh, this is just an encore recording of our very first interview with Ken Levine from last year. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. Hello, and welcome to this special Episode 5 beta edition of Dev Game Club, the show where I and my host, a man who instills fear into clowns,
Tim Longo,
try to talk about a game from our deep history. And this week we're joined by a special guest to talk about that history, the man behind System Shock 2, Thief, Bioshock Infinite, the voice of the Circus of Values, Mr. Ken Levine. Ken, how are you doing?
I am very good, and I can't do that voice because my wife hates it, and she's in the room. I cannot do the clown.
Darn it!
That lovely, the sonorous sounds of the Circus of Values clown.
Yeah. I don't think you were value rep, though.
I don't think it had did it have a voice? I don't remember.
It had a...
Yeah, it totally does. Yeah,
we'll get to that. I immediately figured it must be you, but it's not. It's got to be a woman's voice, I think.
Yeah, that was not me. I was in System Shock too, but I'm kind of embarrassed to say who I was because it was pretty bad.
Oh, interesting. You got to reveal that though.
Maybe we'll see how tonight goes.
Yeah, organic.
Organic.
You know, I don't know where exactly it starts. So maybe somewhere near the beginning, I guess. For us, you know, we're looking at this game, and you would have been starting building it maybe a little bit before Half-Life 2 came out, would be my guess. I recall the game took about 18 months to build. So you would have started in like March of 98. And it didn't start as System Shock 2. Is that true?
Yeah, we started... We started the prototype, I think, probably in October of 97. And what happened is we had funding from Looking Glass to do a prototype. And the idea is that they would sort of act as a middleman and go out and try to get a publisher for the title. And we didn't have the rights to the System Shock name at that point. And the whole System Shock name legal stuff is very, very complicated. So I won't bore anybody with that stuff now. But it was very unclear who owned the rights to that for many, many years. But Looking Glass, at least at that point, felt they didn't have the rights to it. So we ended up doing I had a game design that, and it didn't even start that way. I mean, Paul said, do you guys want to do a game, any game? And we sort of came with this idea that we would do a game very much like a System Shock style game. But we didn't know if we'd get the rights to the franchise at all. So it was just called Shock, actually. And it had a plot that was fairly different, much more like an Apocalypse Now plot, where there was a guy, a military leader who went on this spaceship who sort of went a little crazy, and you were hired to assassinate him. And then we did this prototype, and we must have done the prototype. Which really basically three of us and maybe a contract artist. Meaning three of us, I mean John Shea, myself, and Rob Vermier were the co-founders of Irrational. And for almost no money, we built this prototype. It was actually like a pseudo-functioning prototype in the Dark Engine, this is long before Thief shipped, so the thing was like really not even working. It was a renderer, but sort of all the game systems just didn't really work, and all the building tools really didn't work. So we sort of hacked together this thing with no art, with like one artist, this very junior artist. Excuse me. And we took it out, and became, eventually we sold it to EA, and when it became EA, we had the rights to call it System Shock and do a proper sequel to System Shock.
Right, and that would have been because I guess EA had bought Origin, probably. Maybe that was that connection. EA
had bought Origin, and so they had the rights to that, and I believe that's how it came. I believe that's how it came about.
So what was the genesis of Irrational for people that don't know? Can you? So you were saying, because right before this, did you work on Thief? Were you a writer on Thief or something?
Yeah,
like that?
I got a job at Looking Glass. My first job in the game industry at Looking Glass in '95, and my first week in, Looking Glass was not. It was a great company. It was not the most organized company. And I remember I showed up there. It was also the video game industry in 1995.
Yeah,
it was pretty wild west. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. But I show up my first day. I moved up from New York, and there's nobody knew what I was supposed to be doing. I didn't have a desk. I didn't have anything. And I remember I just sat there in a corner in a chair, not knowing what to do. And eventually I just went to the 2-3 days in. I just went to the movies. I didn't know what else I was supposed to do. So I went and saw a double feature. It was Something and Seven. There's 2 movies. Well, it wasn't really a double feature. I just went to 2 movies. And because I was trying to get through the day. And I came back and somebody runs up to me and they go, "Oh, Ken, where you been? You're supposed to go be with Doug Church." And I was like, Doug was a hero of mine. I was a huge fan of System Shock 1 and Ultima Underworld. And somehow somebody made a decision somewhere to put the new kid, me, to work with Doug on the thing that eventually became Thief. And I just started hanging out with Doug. And that was I went from, the movie theater working with Doug Church in 10 minutes.
Wow. Double feature of 7. I wish you remember what the other one was. That's a weird combo.
It's a 7 and 7, probably.
7 and 7, yeah. Magnificent 7 and 7.
Ooh, nice.
And so, Jonathan Chait, and who was the other?
Rob Fermier.
Oh, right, of course, yeah. Were they at?
They were Looking Glass, yes.
Okay, yeah. All right.
They were both at Looking Glass, and I ended up working halftime on Thief and halftime on a Star Trek Voyager game, which Looking Glass had been hired to do, which never shipped. And Rob and John were on that project. And that's where I met them and sort of hit them all. I was very impressed with Rob because he had worked on System Shock and I think on Underworld 2, System Shock 1 and Underworld 2. And John was just starting at Looking Glass. He probably came on board about a month before I did, but he was just obviously the smartest person I've ever met. And he just had an amazing way of thinking about things. And, both Rob and John were extremely impressive. And we ended up becoming friends and, working on this project together. And I think they both were sort of dragooned into work on Thief at various points. And so they were most of the time on the Star Trek game, which was not in the Unreal Engine. Not in the Dark Engine, which the Dark Project engine. And I was sort of halftime on each. And on Thief, I sort of I worked on the initial design with Doug, sort of came up with working with him on the sort of noise propagation stuff and enemies hearing you, just those concepts and the world and the whole notion of an enemy saying, "Hey, is somebody there?" That was not a sort of regular concept. The sort of enemies not yet fully aware of you and not unaware of you. We sort of working on enemies, sensory becoming aware of you, which I think probably had been in Kojima games to some degree before that, but nobody really done it in a first-person shooter. And then I sort of drove the world creation at the beginning on Thief and, sort of set the tone of the world and the characters and the basic plot. But, honestly, I left to go do Irrational. And so I can't really, other people took over and executed extremely well from this sort of things that I set up.
Right. So then the three of you left jointly and formed Irrational.
Yeah.
You must have been nearby or in the same building or something because you ended up working with Irrational on System Shock 2. At least that's what the history says.
Yeah, with Looking Glass. Yeah, they called us up and we were working out of my apartment. And part of the deal was they offered us office space as well as some money to do this thing and some assistance from their people.
And then what was the back and forth like with it? I mean, was it primarily an Irrational game, or did Looking Glass have oversight? Or
No, I mean, we basically, John was the product leader, Rob was the lead programmer, I was the lead designer and the writer. And we had some great people helping us from Looking Glass, like Eric Procius doing the sound, and Dorian Hart doing game balance, and they had the support of the engine people who were doing the engine for Thief. And we had, IT support and stuff like that. But we were sort of responsible. We were responsible for delivering the milestones to Looking Glass for approval, and they would then pass them on to the publisher. But John, Rob, and I had the responsibility, the contractual responsibility to get those milestones done.
Interesting. Yeah. So even then, having that sort of co-development with as well as a publisher. Didn't seem like that was very common. It's more common maybe even these days, but
no. I mean, we basically probably, if I was like more business savvy back then, because it was my first game I never shipped a game before.
Right.
I left before Thief was done, so I was the president of the company doing the business, the sort of deal negotiation. I was, the lead designer and the writer, creative director type, and all of us were wearing like 5 hats. John was a product leader and a programmer and like doing the taxes at the company, and Rob was like doing the healthcare plan and lead programming and helping on the design. And we all had to wear we're entrepreneurs, right? We all had to wear a lot of hats. We were indie developers, but we sort of figured out, and it was helpful to have, the fact that we were working on Looking Glass's office. They had an infrastructure, they had computers. We were all basically, the whole thing was done in one small room, essentially. The entire team sort of crammed into there. I think Looking Glass got a pretty good deal out of it. But I think we all, it was beneficial to everybody in the end.
Sure.
Yeah, that's unusual. I mean, going back that far, I can't really think of any other partnerships quite like that. The closest I can think of is maybe Naughty Dog and Insomniac, who shared some early PS2-like level tech. But even that would have been, I guess that would have been around this time maybe. And even there, I don't think it was that they were really born one out of the other. It was more they just were both wherever in Burbank or something.
In the end, considering we didn't own the IP and we didn't actually, we didn't make any money off the thing. It was probably we were just glorified employees that could pay a lot less because we quote had our own company.
Yeah,
and
right.
So we had the responsibility of running this thing and all that, but they didn't have to, they paid us as contractors. We didn't, well, not even as individual contractors. They paid us advances against royalties. Imagine if you were a contractor and you had to put in milestones that had to get approved. You weren't even getting paid hourly or anything. Right. So it was a pretty good deal for them. I wish I could figure out some suckers to coerce into doing something like we did, but it ended up being good for us too. So I'm not complaining.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a heck of a way to launch a studio's career because it really is a classic in terms of design and the feel of that world, all stuff that I think we're going to get into. But yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that sort of thinking about that early, starting to design the thing that we thought a little bit and asked ourselves a little bit about in the last podcast or the one prior was, we worked in Star Wars games at this time, so we kind of knew our audience was Star Wars people maybe first and gamers maybe second. And we wondered, what was your audience or your imagining of your audience at that time?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, I think I know so little, it was such a long time ago, and we knew there was no internet really, and it was very, very young. You didn't really have a relationship with I didn't have a Twitter account,
Right. Yeah.
I interact with my audience all the time now, every day, all the time. I hear what they have to say all the time. You really didn't have any connection with your audience at all back then. And So I don't think I really thought about the audience. I kind of, made the game that was like, well, what, John, Rob, and I sat around and said, well, what kind of game would we like to make? Mm. And we all love System Shock 1. And, I think it was the game that really got me into, it was the game that really sort of, for me, said that this is the kind of games I would like to be making. Or like, hey, maybe I could be valuable to making games because, hey, there's some interesting writing in here. And maybe there is, maybe this is something for a writer to do in these things. So I think that I think that audience didn't really come into it at that point.
Yeah, it's a different time for sure. Of course, right? I mean, I think that's more and more as the years went on. Audience becomes, and to Brett's question, I'm wondering if maybe our perspective was skewed because we were at Lucas, who was thinking about audience maybe more than other companies had at the time. I mean, I'm sure EA was, and I'm sure the publishers were, but, those times when, to your point, there wasn't a need to think that way because you were just you had a small team and you were just going to make what you wanted to make to some degree as long as people paid you. And we, I guess speaking for myself a little bit, there's different luxuries these days as far as that goes because the pressure is different. The audience is more known.
Yeah, at the time, I mean, I can remember the only, sort of ways that you could understand what developers were doing were to finger John Carmack or something, and see his plan file. Yeah. On the sort of, it wasn't even really the web then. It was really just kind of the internet, and that was a strange thing to just kind of like, I can poke at this guy and see what he has recently written. And there's no history, it was sort of a proto-Twitter in a way, but without kind of a...
It was a one-way street.
Timeline, right, exactly. Right. And there was no way to, he had to finger you. He'd have to know about you. It sounds really disturbing every time I say it.
Stop. Just stop.
If you want to keep talking about fingering John Carmack, that's really your call.
Oh, no. So you were... So you mentioned... System Shock 1, Ultima Underworld. Brett and I talked a lot about those as well, and pretty influential games on us too. But can you talk about some of the ways that those, maybe some of them are obvious influences, but maybe there's some that aren't obvious to us or to the player about how those impact System Shock 2?
Well, the word emergent, I hadn't heard when I played those games. I hadn't heard that word. I first heard it when I came to Looking Glass, and that notion of immersion, the player's immersion in experience, and gameplay that was emergent.
Yeah,
were things that I had never, you never really encountered, except in small places. Like I grew up loving games like Shoplifter. I remember that's one of my favorite games. You ever play that? You ever play Shoplifter?
Mm-hmm. I sure did. Apple II Plus for me.
Because there was quite a lot of emergent situations that can come out of that experience. Like there was enough systems at play butting heads up against each other that some really unique things could happen. I also like Defender because it was enough things were going on that created a sort of soup of chaos that you sense you had some control over. And I always liked the more games with the more simulational elements like that. Like I liked Asteroids more than Space Invaders because one was simulational to some degree and one wasn't. So when I played Underworld, I remember I had a situation where I was fighting some goblins or something, and of course the clarity of the experience might be increased in my memory because I'm sure it was such a crude visual representation at the time. Remember Underworld was just in that tiny little window because that's all they could afford to render. It wasn't full screen.
Quarter of the screen or something like that.
Yeah, it was this tiny thing. And I remember I was like fighting and like things like in Underworld where you could take chicken or whatever and put it on the fire and it would turn into cooked chicken. I love stuff like that. I mean, that's not even really simulation. That's just sort of goofball, fun little hacks. But then I think there was a situation I was fighting some goblins and I decided the discretion was a better part of valor, so I decided to run away. And I jump off this ledge or something, and the goblins are still chasing me, and I run into like a giant spider. And all of a sudden, I'm going to fight with goblins and spiders. And before that, that wouldn't happen in Might and Magic 6, or whatever, Might and Magic 3, where you were sort of on this grid. And it wouldn't happen in Doom, because you didn't have the whole level of resource management and character growth that you've had in those games. So yeah, you got the sort of chaotic funhouse experiences, but you couldn't really plan and strategize, and you couldn't conserve your resources. So all those things combined, all those systems combined, it just struck me in a way that I never, and that, what was that, 25 years ago now.
Yeah.
Something like that. And
yeah, 2022, I think.
I still remember
maybe,
that experience.
More, yeah, maybe 91. Yeah,
I think it was like 25 years ago.
I think you're right. Yeah, long time.
And I still remember it.
Yeah, I think emergent gameplay for sure. Looking Glass definitely led the charge on that stuff, and Warren and and all of the folks early Origin stuff. And I think I won't speak for Brett, but I think replaying System Shock 2, I also hadn't played it since it came out, and just being surprised and delighted about how well it held up in that regard, especially from emergent gameplay, and also just persistent world, or a sense of persistent world, going back and forth between the floors and having things saved in the states that they were saved, to make sure that that's possible, and sometimes necessary, but sometimes it's a choice, and also something that shooters specifically didn't do a lot of, if at all.
And what I sort of feel, what happens in these sort of emergent games is like you were talking about Doom. Doom has this like constant propulsion, adrenaline thing going, which is great, but it is kind of maybe constantly at that level to a degree. Whereas with an emergent game, typically there are real thoughtful moments and then moments of pure panic, and I think you have maybe a wider range of emotional response. And of course, it's not scripted in any way, so each player is going to have their own adrenaline pumping moments that lead to that sort of water cooler talk of like, oh man, you won't believe what happened to me last night. I was running from these goblins and then I found a spider lair or whatever. Right. It's a unique sort of thing that really only games can provide.
Well, I think what you're talking about to some degree is that they're your moments. Like in Doom, I love Doom. And Doom I played to death when it came out. But, the moments that happen in that game where sort of, you walk over a trigger of some kind and then a wall opens and a bunch of demons come out, which was great. And you really had that amazing weapon feeling and, the great sort of balancing of movement and range of attacks, etc. But with these games, they were they were experience that I had that nobody else really had in playing that game, and that was what was so special to me. And I think it really rang all the bells for me as a game player. And then eventually I had no idea at that point I'd get into design, and they had done so much of the heavy lifting by the time we got to System Shock 2. I think it was just really. It was just time for somebody to take all the little pieces and put it together with something that felt, with a real 3D engine and enough interface affordances to make it feel like, to make it so it's still kind of playable today. It had a mouse look, for instance, which in other games it had before, except for Thief. So I think it was sort of a culmination of a lot of work that had been done along the way.
Yeah, you see the breadcrumbs for sure, from those previous games. But I think one of the reasons we chose System Shock 2 as our first one is we want the audience to try to play along with us as well, and I think it's it lends itself better to that than kind of going too far back, and it did have a lot of those modern conveniences that we take for granted, and we didn't at that time. Yeah, sorry, Brett, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So how did you, as a guy who had been working in the industry for a pretty short time, how did you get around to making this thing? It's such a broad question, but literally from a design standpoint, what was your process for building this thing that is so many, like we've talked about on the show, it's like 5 genres, when you look it up, it's a survival horror and it's first person shooter and et cetera, right? It's all these different things. Yet it doesn't feel kitchen sinky, it doesn't, it's not like a Bethesda game,
I mean, now that you asked the question, I think maybe we did think about we thought about the audience in this sense. And I think about this aspect of thinking about the audience led us to the game design, which was we knew the engine was strong in some ways and not very strong in other ways. We knew, like, as a competitor we knew we couldn't really make a shooter because we would get crushed by Quake. We knew it wasn't really multiplayer. Well, it originally wasn't supposed to be multiplayer at all. It wasn't fast. I think you guys talked about it on the podcast before, of it being just a renderer. It actually had a lot of game systems in it as well. And the systems allowed for a lot of objects in the world, but they also were very, very slow to spawn objects. So, for instance, I think, when you fired a machine gun, it would take literally, 160 milliseconds to spawn a bullet.
Oh, man.
And, for each round of that machine gun. So you really had to rethink what kind of shooter you were making because it had this very complicated hierarchical object system, which was great for Thief and not as good for this. So we had to there were certain decisions we had to make. So we said, well, let's not make a shooter. We like first-person games, but let's make a shooter that, it has, instead of a few systems that are really tightly tuned like Quake, we know we can't rely on any one thing that much, so let's just build a lot of things, and hopefully people won't notice how broken they are. And that's what we did. I think they're probably, if you look, feature for feature, probably a lot of those features didn't have as much polish as you'd see in a lot of games that had fewer features, but we built enough of them that together they, it's like, they make fish stew out of old fish, right? You have a bunch of kind of rotty old fish, and you throw them in there and you make a stew, and all of a sudden together, you're getting a nice melange of stuff where maybe those pieces of fish wouldn't have held up so great on the plate by themselves. It's sort of like a fish stew.
So that point about the engine makes a lot of sense, but because it's so projectile heavy as far as the combat goes, like almost, especially I played Psionic this time, and so almost everything I think is a projectile based. And I was definitely curious about that. That's a good insight.
That's a long time to spawn a bullet.
It may have been a little more, a little less. I can't exactly remember, but it was like a long time.
That's a very specific number, so it's just interesting to me that's like, it takes 5 frames before the bullet comes out. I'm like, now I understand why the assault rifle is just more powerful and not faster.
Yes, that's exactly. I think I remember that conversation where, a lot of times, and I'm sure you've had this experience, you sort of put up with something in the development thinking that it's going to get fixed eventually. And then somebody says, I think it was John, comes along and says, there's a reason why the machine gun's acting so weird. And so we just had to make different decisions.
Almost every day, it seems like.
Yeah, those are the constraints. I mean, those constraints, lead to those interesting creative moments, right?
Absolutely.
I can't do this thing. What can I do instead? And especially at the time, when there was fewer people on a project, and the machines were not powerful. I mean, you were really led to a lot of your decisions by those sorts of limitations.
Yeah, I mean, and often it's a good thing. I mean, constraints are good. They force us to think differently, and happy accidents accidents can come from that. So, it's frustrating and maddening sometimes, but definitely good can come from it. And I think this game is a good example, whether you guys, always planned it or not. One of the things we did talk a lot about, and I want to get back to the sort of the fish stew of systems in a second, but just we talked a lot about how those things mix together in unexpected ways, and there was jank in there for sure, but it ended up being okay because the stories. It was fun to play this in this podcast format because Brett and I intentionally chose different paths, and so every time we would come together, we of course didn't know what each other, how we were handling the game, and so we got to tell those water cooler stories, as you said, Ken, your own stories to each other, each podcast, and kind of discover them on the fly, it was kind of fun. I hope the audience had that same experience.
Yeah, and everything was kind of at the same level of jank, right? So there wasn't like one thing that stood out, where you're like, oh, that's the thing that they wanted to do the most. And so that is really kind of interesting to me to hear you say, like, we just put a lot of stuff in. I can imagine just like cramming as many things in. And, Todd has talked about like how you end up shining a spotlight on a few things in a Bethesda game. And this is kind of a different thing where you kept kind of like making more and more and taking everything to the same level. I'm sure there's things that were cut, but it is kind of a different approach, right?
I don't know. I mean, like in Todd's, I kind of feel Todd is still, and all you guys who are working on at Bethesda, still very much remind me of that sort of old school way of thinking. Like Fallout is a.
Well, I'm no longer at Bethesda.
Oh, you're no longer at Bethesda. Sorry.
No. I left a couple years. That's fine.
Well, certainly Fallout 3, Fallout 3, Skyrim, those games, they still feel like kind of old school games to me.
Oh, yeah.
And that they're not uber polished, but they're uber broad, especially when they come out. And I think gamers have sort of said we're okay with that, and that always surprised me. And I'm sort of very gratified that there's sort of a move away from very few things, but all super shiny to, hey, you know what? It's okay if things have gamers are saying, I think it's okay if things have a little bit of cruft on them. We're kind of okay with that. We'd rather have more cool stuff, and maybe it's not all 1,000% polished.
Yeah,
absolutely. All right, let's take a quick break, and then we definitely want to come back and talk about world building and the environment. I know there's some film influences in this game, and we'll get that after a quick break. Okay?
Yep.
How dare you, insect? How dare you interrupt my ascendance? You are nothing. A wretched bag of flesh. What are you compared to my magnificence?
Welcome back from the break. We're here speaking Tim Longo and Ken Levine and myself, Brett Duville, about System Shock 2. I think we especially really want to dig into the sort of world building, especially because it's something we talked a lot about as one of our sort of pillars. One of the things we took away from the game is just how tight and strong the world building is. Tim, you're a level designer by trade. You want to kind of talk about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd say our topics kind of hit two different vectors. One was sort of the sense of place and visual storytelling, which I think obviously BioShock was also a leader in its time. But also the other vector that I'm most interested in is the sense of kind of a connected world and persistent world, and a sense of that you guys tried really hard to make it feel like a functioning ship with all the different amenities that a ship might have, and kind of talking about the variety of that. But the sense of persistence and connectedness, which games like Doom that we talked about and even Half-Life, the kind of going backwards and forwards through the levels. I mean, each level in and of itself was pretty cohesive, but then the ship overall from a macro sense was also cohesive. And so could you talk about, some of the decisions and reasons that you guys wanted to do that, if you recall?
Yeah, well, something I took away from playing the original System Shock was sort of a sense of naturalism in the voice performances. That usually, video game performances were quite, characters were a bit over the top and superhero kind of characters. And
right. I mean, they were no Enrique Cortez.
That's right. You got me there. You found it out. But, in System Shock 1, you had a lot of people who were just like regular Joes, and to the point where they were played by people in the studio quite often. I thought that sort of working, even though it was science fiction and it was sort of, a spaceship and speed of light travel and all that, I thought trying to make it as believable as possible was really important. And to make that believable, the spaceship had to feel like a functional place, as well as having the characters feel as believable characters. And so we really try to say, and we had very limited tools. We had a very small art team. And we had this very limited engine that could, pump out, I don't know, 300 polygon scenes, 200 polygon scenes, something like that, something ridiculously small.
Right, something tiny. Yeah, I mean, obviously the character art is limited. Your animation budget was limited. You have a lot of limitations on your storytelling. So you had to do it with the space.
Yeah, very, very limited space and really low BSP counts and all that. And so we had to make very smart choices. And I think the minimalist approach was sort of, that any detail you saw would be a detail that mattered. Because we couldn't, it's sort of the opposite if you played The Division, where I'm sort of in awe about how many assets they can push, let alone create, right? How many assets, the kind of memory it would take to put all those assets in a scene. And probably all the very clever tricks they're doing to make that happen. Like I'm guessing they have some kind of like real-time garbage creation system, so that stuff isn't in memory or something like that. Because there's so much detail. And System Shock 2, as you said, it's very, very crude. But I think we try to tie, whenever you have a weakness, try to make it a strength. So, I guess you would, when something was there and it wasn't part of the sort of standard hallway, you'd notice it more.
Right.
Because it popped out more.
Right.
So every little piece of narrative content we had really popped out because the backgrounds were so simple.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was playing one of our games last year, Republic Commando, and I went through a hallway and I found a piece of art that was way higher poly and higher texture resolution than the things around it. And I looked at it and thought, is that how did that happen? That seems important, and it's so totally not. I mean, it's maybe the only time you ever see this thing. And this game never has that, right? I mean, anytime you see something, it is kind of important and necessary, and not just because the artist, spent extra time on that for whatever reason that day.
It's an interesting rule that you guys needed to apply to yourselves, that to your point about Division or most modern high-fidelity games these days, we, for better or for worse, I don't hear that rule very much, from people. It's like, well, we can make it, so we're going to make it, and we're going to put it someplace, and it's going to cost a lot of money to make it, and we're going to put it, maybe we'll use it in multiple places, but that sense of economy, for whatever reason, not just economy in the actual literal sense of the word in this game, but the word economy came to mind a lot while we were playing this game. Economical design, economical level design, systems, and enemy design as well. And it's interesting to hear you say that as a, necessity, mother of invention kind of way, which is cool. Can you talk a little bit about the persistence kind of the whole ship too, and kind of going backwards and forwards? Was that, maybe Underworld and System Shock 1 was kind of that's the influence there, but how important was that to you guys?
And how did you fit that into the Thief engine? Because I wouldn't have thought that would have been something they needed to do or support.
I'm trying to think. I seem to remember feeling it was very important, and then I remember walking away from the project and feeling like we didn't leverage it enough.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of work to maintain, and I think that, if I look back and I post-mortem my own work on that was probably the thing where I asked the most out of the team and returned the least. Because I thought it was really, really important. And look, maybe it is, maybe it's part of the feeling that makes System Shock 2, but I don't I didn't think we quite understood the full potential of that. And where if you play a game because I guess it was a very small scale open world experience, sort of, it was like an early.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Level loads aside, it feels like an open world.
Well,
but
it's
owing a lot more to the pre-GTA types of open world games, like the Bethesda games and the Underworld games than the GTA kind of open world games.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I would tend to agree with you that you guys probably underutilized it from a strict design sense. However, Brett and I had a couple stories that we told while we were playing where, and it goes back to our conversation about emergence in general, where unexpectedly I had played things in a different order than he had, and I thought that I was playing in the correct order, and he played in a different order. And I kind of, as we talked about it afterwards, we realized the only way that was even possible was because of the world structure. And even if you guys didn't explicitly use it as much as you could have, there was always, when you're playing the game, there's always that notion in the back of your head that if I really need to go back, I can.
Yeah.
And that isn't the case, in a game during 98, 99 era, for the most part, other than RPGs, and so, I don't know. It was just something that kept hitting me, and kind of, especially being as long ago as it was just a nice, maybe it was a nice to have, but at least it was there.
Yeah, and it felt really special to accomplish goals on one side of a level load that changed the state of another side of a level load. I mean, that's a big deal, and a reason why this felt really memorable, and I think really lends the sense of place. I mean, that tech ties into your world design. If you don't have that, then I don't think that holds up as well.
Well, I think the two, even independent of sort of the different levels, the different decks of the ship, I think that the first level, the medical level, is a very good example of what I call a racetrack design, which is you sort of have a hallway that sort of takes you around the whole thing, but then you have all these hierarchical structures leading off of that hallway, and that gives you a very nooks and cranny kind of feeling for the level, and a feeling that there's a lot of places to explore and discover, and I think that as compared to some of the later levels, and I heard you guys talking about this, and I'll be honest with you, we were a very small team. We had very little time. The amount of time we spent reviewing the later level, we made a decision. We can only spend time reviewing, really spending real attention on part of the game. We just didn't have enough time. And that's what happens when you have 14 months and, a few people. I spent very little time reviewing the later levels. I just didn't have, we just didn't have the bandwidth. So the quality bar, I think, goes down pretty far substantially as the game goes on. Certainly it takes a dip, and then you get to the levels we made that classic mistake with the many level where we tried to, let's do something completely different, which we have never done before, and late in the game. And we didn't have the systems to support it. We didn't have the art assets to support it. But I guess I'm still amazed that it's even what we did got done in that period of time.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you're under that kind of pressure. We had the Latent Starfighter. We realized we had way more game than we could make with the team we had, and we cut a third of it. Is that right, Tim? Something like a third?
Oh yeah.
And
at least
that would happen at that time. Is that and on the other hand, I mean, you couldn't really cut levels like that. You kind of had bit off what you had to build. And we had a mission structure. Nothing carried over.
Yeah.
If there was story stuff that carried over, it was purely in voice lines and text on screen. It didn't really matter. You couldn't go back. But here, you had a ship that was going to be its 5 decks and this other ship and the body of the many and all that stuff. I mean, you were kind of locked into that, I would think, for pretty early on.
Yeah, I think I don't remember. I'm trying to remember what we cut, if we cut anything. I don't know if we really had that mentality at that point. I think we just said, I think we just spread the butter thinner over the bread, Yeah. And that probably wasn't the right idea. We probably should have just ended up cutting a bunch of the game and making the whole thing better. But I think maybe that was an experience. Maybe we didn't even sort of think about that. Or maybe, like you said, it's just a lot harder in a non-mission based game to do those cuts. You can end up making more work for yourself.
Yeah, I can't imagine, if I were to take this game, say a couple months before it was going to come out and try to figure out what to cut, I don't even know what I would do.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to even imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, guys, one thing I did hear you talking about, I heard you guys saying you wish there was a storage chest where you could put all your stuff into.
Mm-hmm. Did
you guys figure out the elevator is that?
What?
Nobody will touch anything. It was sort of an unsupported feature, but it exists. It exists. It's on every level, and it's persistent between every level. So you could just drop stuff in the elevator, and it's like your infinite size storage chest.
Son of a!
Oh wow!
Just like real life.
Yeah, just like real life.
That is good.
That's why I put all my stuff at work. I just leave it on the elevator.
Yeah, right. I see how it works now.
Gosh. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we didn't look at any facts or anything before we started. So.
No, definitely, and not while we played either.
So on the sorry, Brett. On the flip side of that, on the system side, you were talking about kind of like putting so many systems in that it kind of overwhelmed the player with options there. And so twofold question. One is sort of talking, if you can, about the classes, the three different sort of routes that players can take, and then also balancing those systems, because you had so many different economies and resource management systems, and then having them with three different classes that you can play. Brett and I talked a lot about sort of how those intermingle with each other and force you to make different decisions, and how different our playthroughs were because of it. And then you were just talking about the amount of time you guys had to review content being so small. I can't. And the game's pretty damn hard. I mean, difficulty tuning wise, I think there's some places where it's unfair and got to a point where I felt like maybe an A-bug was coming my way. Can you talk about sort of the system side of things?
Yeah, well, so I wrote with conjunction with Rob and John. I wrote the initial design document, and then a guy named Dorian Hart, who goes back to Underworld 2 and System Shock, and he led Terra Nova, came on to help from the Looking Glass side, came on to help sort of balance all the game systems. And I think he had a really hard job, which was, in a very short period of time, to make it the only guy really driving the systems, numbers side, the entire experience.
Yeah, wow.
And, very little time. We didn't have like large numbers of people play testing and focus testing. We had a very small QA team. And, he just really had to do a lot of guesswork, I think, because there's no way to really get proper information. And I think he did a pretty, considering that, I think it's a pretty amazing, incredible job he did. And I think it spiked a few times, like what you're talking about. But it was, probably a job for, 2 or 3 people, and he did it by him. And, for that period of time, it would have to be a job for 2 or 3 people, and he did it by himself. And it's especially hard because there weren't a lot of real models for it. It was one of the first games that really combined player skill and character skill in that way, because usually RPGs at that point were just character skill and shooters were just player skill.
Right.
So it's really the first, I think, real RPG where you had a lot of choice as to how you grew your character and because the character classes were pseudo classes. They were at the beginning, but then they basically opened up to whatever you wanted them to be once you got on the ship. If I recall correctly, I think that's the case.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think you can you start with some amount of skill based on your class choice, but then you could pick whatever. You could, purely pick psi powers as a Marine if you wanted to.
Right. Which not having classes even opened up the possibility space even further, which made balancing even harder.
Yeah.
So I think it was pretty extraordinary, but it's definitely too hard. That place is definitely too hard. And like the weapons degradation system was balanced too hard. But I think that probably all in all, we ended up getting lucky, most of the time, because it was just the amount of time we had was so tiny. I can't even describe how little time we had to make that game.
Yeah, that's pretty astounding. To your point, you definitely had some happy accidents happen there too, and with one person working on that stuff, it is pretty astounding.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. That's astonishing, actually.
And we'll give
this game was built.
Sorry?
No, I just like how quickly this game was made and how well it holds up. I mean, it's a feat.
I think the amazing thing too is that I think Rob and Dorian, Fermier and Dorian, have shipped some games. Almost everybody on the team had never shipped a game before.
Wow.
John and I both had never shipped a game before, and all the junior guys had never shipped a game before. It was pretty crazy.
Wow. Pretty neat, though. Makes for a good story. Speaking of which,
at the time, I'm sure they were pulling all their hair out.
Yeah,
of course, you also don't know what you don't know what you can't do too, right? As somebody coming in, not having done it, you have sort of an expansive, we can do anything sort of feel, right? Because you don't really know where the limits are. You don't know what you've bitten off if you're kind of new to the game. development biz.
Yeah, I think, there's that term. It's called the genius of the novice, right? Which you don't have the fear of experience. That experience is sort of the benefit that experience has given you, that fear that experience has given you, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't take on this ridiculous, impossible task.
Right.
And
Roberta Williams talks about that as like, she would say, and at the time, this would have been in the late 90s, I would think this was crazy. She would say, I don't want to know what's technically feasible or possible. I don't want to know about that because it limits my thinking, And that was somebody who at that point was pretty experienced in games development, but she tried to stay away. She tried to maintain that sort of novice mind,
Yeah. I think it can swing both ways, right? I think the other side is that there are a lot of designers who don't play to the strengths of what this tool set they have is. And, so like if we understood that this was not going to be a great shooter, this engine, not make a great shooter, and that knowledge really helped us. I think we didn't understand how much work the whole thing was going to be and how few resources we had. And so I think that, it helps to not have knowledge, but it's also helpful to keep your eyes open.
Yeah. Well, so on the, I think one category we haven't really talked much about at all is just the story side of things, and maybe a bit of a segue at the end. Maybe if we can talk about System Shock 2's influences on BioShock 1, but
sure.
On the story side, you have a twist in there. You have a bunch of sci-fi themes and tropes, and you see some influences maybe from some film, as Brett mentioned. Can you kind of talk about the story development itself? You mentioned more realistic, naturalistic characters, which I love hearing coming from a theater background. Naturalism being my favorite kind of theater. So can you hit some of those that process for you?
Yeah, I think that there was I think I grew up really loving. Look, I love Star Wars, and that really changed my life when I was a kid. But I also really loved sort of this earlier '70s science fiction films, and then things that got carried on. I think you guys are talking about like Alien. If you look at Alien versus Aliens,
yeah,
they're very different films. And I think a lot of video games have been much more like Aliens. And
right.
I think we were very influenced by a movie like Alien that was about a bunch of very normal people stuck in a really impossible situation. Mm-hmm. Those were not superheroes on the Nostromo. They were a bunch of, people, blue collar workers, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I loved watching them get in that situation and having to either rise or not rise. They were not, they were complaining about how much money they made. There was definitely some class stuff going on between the guys at the bottom of the totem pole versus the captain and Ripley. Some jealousies, and I just loved this sort of how real it felt, even though it was science fiction. And I thought that System Shock 1 had some of that, that sort of very normal people kind of thing. And I wanted to play that up and really keep that, and because I thought it would, especially once you bring in this sort of larger than life character and these ridiculous aliens and monsters and stuff like that, keeping them super grounded against a background of normal people is just very exciting to me. It's something I hadn't seen a lot in games.
Yeah, absolutely. The way
you still don't see a ton of in games, to be honest.
No, it's still rare, unfortunately. Yeah, it's definitely good to hear you with that you had that goal even back then. And I think that you mentioning that kind of it refreshes my memory in some of the audio logs specifically on how it was so well written in many of the audio logs where they would talk about things that either you haven't seen yet, like an enemy, or even enemies you had seen, but they would describe them in their own real person ways, and it's kind of that thriller or horror trope of the way that people describe stuff makes it creepier than it actually is in your mind. And I thought that those were a lot of nice touches in there with that.
Well, because look, the characters, the enemies looked ridiculous, right?
Right.
They didn't even hold up at the time. They were not good. We had such a low poly budget. We had no artist, half an artist working on it. So the sound, though, Eric Brosius, who did the sound,
Yeah.
and Kamal, who did the sound, did extraordinary work. And so we knew that we could put those monsters in the audio spaces, and they would sound amazing.
Yeah.
Because I think we probably have some of the best sound design I've ever heard in a game in that game. And so we have almost 100% like clarity in the audio space and about 5% clarity in the visual space. So we try to lean on the audio space as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the characterization, in those stories comes through so much. I mean, looking at the big twist of the Doctor turning into Shodan is, if you'd been paying attention to like her tone, you'd realize that this is not somebody who has a lot of respect for you, as Ippolito, right? I mean, it's really, really solid writing, but also, voice acting and voice direction to bring that out, because that could have been much softer and seductive, but she's just so far convinced, Shodan is, of her superiority that even when she's trying to get you to do something by pretending to be human, she can't help but be hoity-toity or whatever.
Yeah, she's an asshole.
Yeah,
excuse my French. And it was really fun to write Polito because there were logs of Politos who were actually Polito, and then you have logs. So you have the same actress playing Polito as you had playing Polito/Shodan, but you have a different actress playing Shodan. So it was really fun to direct the actress in her Polito logs and then direct her pretending to be Polito, but she's actually got Shodan's personalities creeping through.
Right.
And that was really fun because I knew I wanted the audience to go to not to hit him in the face, but to go back and to listen to her progression and realize, well, there's a difference in the Polito I heard on that audio, the dead Polito, and the Polito who talked to me over the radio.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you did the voice direction then?
Yeah, I wrote everything and did the voice direction.
Was that all local talent then? Was it all in Boston?
Pretty much. We had Stephen Russell in it who did. We had like 2 or 3 professional actors. The woman who played Polito was a professional actress. When I say professional actress, I mean she's very good, but they were all local actors. We didn't there's nobody. It's all from Boston, yeah. And then we had Stephen Russell playing, who was the guy who did the lead in Thief, who ended up being what's his name, Diego, and that's about it. I mean, Terry Brosius, who had done Shodan before, and that's really it. The rest of it were people, people are in the studio, I think, pretty much. Maybe a couple other actors.
Yeah,
pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's very strong considering that. There's very few audio logs that I could remember and thinking, oh, that was maybe probably non-professional.
We wrote for human. We didn't write for actors. We wrote for people who could just read as natural as they possibly could. And we had a couple really solid actors local, people in the team who were solid actors like Dan Thrawn, a couple people, but yeah, mostly it was just people on the team.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing because they do really hold up very well. And I think it is a credit to that natural style of writing. I mean, this feels like people who are just in their normal everyday, and this extraordinary thing is happening that they don't really understand.
Yeah, look, you can't cast somebody on the team to play Elizabeth or Booker or Andrew Ryan. Those characters are written a much bigger, character. Right. So that you'd be wasting Courtney Draper, if you just did her just doing naturalistic, lines from System Shock 2 audio logs. So you have to write for what you got.
Right. So you did that. I mean, you knew going in, I'm not going to have a voice budget or a budget for lots of actors.
Yeah. And I had directed. I'd done a lot of plays, and so I had directed a lot of people already. So I had some experience knowing how to work with actors of various skill levels.
Huh.
Cool.
Huh. Yeah, that is cool. You're really bringing everything you could.
You gotta, you gotta bring everything you got to the party. I mean, because it's the odds, as you guys know. I mean, the odds against every game are stacked so high, already that you gotta give every advantage to yourself you can.
They hate to be made.
They do. That's great. I love that. They do not want you to make them. It's true.
Yeah, I steal that from Sean and Jake over at Firewatch Campo Santo.
That's great.
Games hate to be made.
They do.
Yeah, that's a good quote. So you mentioned Andrew Ryan in there. Are there any sort of breadcrumbs that you could share or that come to mind when it comes to System Shock 2 to BioShock being, the spiritual successor and all that?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of thematic and gameplay, and it's very much a game that I don't think we could have made if we hadn't made System Shock 2 before. I think we learned a lot making System Shock 2. I think we had on BioShock, we didn't have on System Shock 2 is the ability to build really detailed, convincing environments.
Right.
But then our I would not have chosen to make an Art Deco beautiful city if I had the Dark Engine, right? We chose to make a very functional looking spaceship. And Spaceship was actually much better suited for the Dark Engine than I think the Thief World was, because spaceships are flat and angular.
Right.
And don't have detailed, things that really want to be normal maps, like, stone and bricks and things like that.
Right, exactly.
So we were all super shiny and flat and metal and angular. And, it would be great to have, certain kinds of shaders. We didn't have any shaders or anything. But then when we had the chance to make BioShock, we had the resources to take more chances, so we could do things like make characters like Andrew Ryan and make a city like Rapture.
Right.
There's a lot of games, along the way, though. I mean, you did some of your own IP in like the Freedom Force games.
Yep.
You did work for hire, and so I'm thinking like SWAT.
Yep, SWAT 4 and Tribes Vengeance, and a game we never shipped called The Lost. We finished, but we never shipped it. Yeah,
I tried so hard to get Todd to let me see that, but he said no go. you guys pitched it to, I don't know if it would have been ZeniMax or Bethesda Softworks or whomever.
Yeah, it was Bethesda, I think. Yeah, we also pitched BioShock to them. Vlatko, you remember Vlatko used to say to me, Ken, worst mistake I ever made, not getting BioShock.
I can hear him saying it.
But we couldn't work out the financial side of it.
Right.
But we had been down. I've been down there a few times, and Todd always admired Bethesda. I think they're probably very, I think if I could work in any other company, it would be either Firaxis or Bethesda if they'd have me, because I think those are the things companies that are most similar to how we think about, how we build things.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, we looked at SWAT 4, I can remember, for Republic Commando because it had had something of a sort of military progression. I mean, it was police instead of commandos, but it had a very similar sort of feel that we were trying to achieve with sort of, characters that you were working together with who are part of your, sort of squad. I don't know. I mentioned that because I just kind of remembered thinking through your irrational oeuvre of things that were things that touched on us at different points in our careers.
No, I think Republic Commandos is very similar to SWAT in a lot of ways, and they're these sort of single player games where you're controlling a squad of guys in first person, which is a super tricky problem, right?
Yeah, that's hard.
Super hard. It's cool, but I actually was making another one of those games after that. We got hired by Take-Two. That was one of the original games we were supposed to make besides BioShock, and I just felt that it was that I didn't really see a way to go beyond what we'd already done and what guys like you had done. I think it's sort of a dead end. Trying to control other characters in 3D space and make that super fun. I think it's very, very, very hard to do. And I think the games that did it about as well as they could do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard problem.
Watch, somebody's going to come along tomorrow and do it great.
Yeah,
some indie studio with 3 people.
Something at E3, it's going to be amazing.
Right. It's going to be like 3 people in an indie studio. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah. We didn't talk about this during the break, but I was curious, what of all this have you taken forward to what you're doing now?
So I heard you guys talking a lot about on the podcast, the sort of conveniences that games have added since System Shock 2. Mm. And like, for instance, getting lost. You guys got lost a lot playing the game, which I'm not surprised about at all. And we worked very, very hard in BioShock, for instance, not to let people get lost. And I think to some degree what's interesting is the gaming space went very much towards and also just not knowing what you're supposed to do. That's sort of something that we sort of try to move away from in the last in the last couple of cycles, right? But I think to some degree, if you look at games like, whether it's Minecraft or you look at Dark Souls,
yeah.
I think there are a breed of games, and I play games like, and all these crafting survival games, Don't Starve, etc. I think there is sort of a movement back towards letting people figure stuff out more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that, especially if you're working on a game that's not a game that has to sell 20 million copies, that's got a different economic that can sell. But however, saying that, Fallout 4, right? That the whole building component was a very nerdy thing, super nerdy thing.
Yeah,
not super polished,
very undirected. Yeah,
very undirected, not incredibly polished, but like games sort of used to be. And I think people really like that. And so I'm really excited about that trend because that feels more like the games I came up with. Though I worked very hard on the BioShock games to sort of move in a different direction. I think it's okay now. You can make games and have them be much more undirected, much more in a way System Shock 2 was undirected.
Yeah, and crunchier in a way.
Yes, a lot crunchier, a lot more systems that aren't all gleaming with polish and gleaming with simplicity, but are more like, hey, maybe you need to go to the wiki page to see how this works.
Right.
That's kind of okay now. There's a sense of discovery that gamers have, and I'm super surprised by that. I'm also super excited by that.
Yeah, it feels like the pendulum probably swung too far the other way. It's like we were way too far out in being too niche, too hard to approach, and that as money got involved, and more console focus and bigger sales and bigger teams and all that stuff, we had to swing back much further to make, to hold hands a lot more.
Yes.
Just in order to get the audiences to justify those budgets.
Exactly.
But having gotten those audiences, now I think those audiences were probably ready to an extent to allow the pendulum to swing back. Probably not as far as System Shock 2 or, the Underworld games or whatever, as they originally were. But certainly further, and kind of come back onto that side of the line.
I sort of view it as what happened with movies, like that you have these studios are taking fewer and fewer risks because fewer and fewer of the movies are making more of the money, so they're spending a ton of money on a few titles. But then if you look what cable TV and stuff have done with those kind of movies, those mid-range movies that have a lot more soul to them, are now going to TV. Those mid-range things that would have been 2-hour movies are now 13-episode television shows. And I think that sort of digital downloadable games that don't have $100 million budget are sort of becoming like the Netflix movies and AMC shows and things like that. And that's sort of where I'm excited to be right now.
Yeah, it's risk. It does really, risk is kind of the main variable that I think changed that for us. And it's interesting because I guess we've all been in the industry for roughly a similar amount of time, and we've seen both sides of it. And the thing that's exciting to me about the Dark Souls trend and the letting the player discover more, which, like you said, we talked a lot about on the podcast, is that I'm hoping and predicting that because many of us have lived through both cycles, that we can go back, like you said, to a new era of kind of being lost, but bring some of what we learned from the era of Uber accessibility. And then we can pick and choose, right? We can say, okay, we're not going to tell them how to do this, but we might tell them how to do this one thing because we learned this one time that we should do it that way, but we're just not going to do it all over the place. And that blending of the two, I'm excited to see, and I'm excited to hear that you're thinking about that too, because I'm excited to see where we go in that regard.
Well, actually, when I was listening to the podcast, your guys' podcast, on my run yesterday, you were talking about getting lost, and I actually started thinking about a system where getting lost was okay, but finding your way back from lost was actually a resource that you spent in the game, and then people could sort of weigh off how important it is to them to find this thing.
Yeah.
And so, and actually, I don't know if it's something we're going to do, but just your conversation made me start thinking about. I forgot how lost you could get in that game, and your conversation did a very good job of illustrating why that was cool, but why it was also really painful and kind of awful. But I think, like you said, I think we could take some of the experience we've learned, go back to a little bit of getting lost, but maybe not have it be bad, but not have it be bad because we didn't know how to do any better, but actually think what's cool about getting lost and what isn't cool about getting lost.
Right.
Well, and give the ownership to the player,
Yes.
like you said, like some system that allows the player to make a more interesting decision about that.
Yeah.
It's another tool in the tool chest now, right? I mean, we had for a long time, we didn't have the tools of accessibility. We couldn't really measure or determine what players were doing, right? I mean, we couldn't really even know they were lost. And we didn't even know once the game was out they were lost unless somebody mentioned it in a review. But now we could actually say, okay, we can actually detect that you're lost.
Yes.
We have the cycles to do that. We could allow that to be a tool in emotional storytelling. It's like, we want you to feel lost for a little while, and that's okay, but we're going to bring you back.
Right.
And it's almost like the storyteller in, Left 4 Dead or whatever, that sort of zombie, management of, we're going to have these waves, but they're not always going to come at the same places. And we're going to have these tougher things that are going to happen, but they're not always going to be in the same places. And that's really just measuring sort of play intensity in a way.
Like you guys were talking about, I think you were talking about wondering if we had any systems that spawn loot based upon the player's heuristics. We did in BioShock. I don't actually think we did it at all. I think they were just loot tables, random loot tables that Dorian made in System Shock. But that's sort of one of the things we learned after BioShock is, hey, maybe we can decide certain places we want the player to be that we think would be a fun range, and we could put our thumb on the scale a little bit, but not too much.
Right. Yeah, because I thought back about that as I thought maybe, because I remember I did actually get things that I didn't need. But it's more memorable when you get a thing that you do need, right? So I think that you naturally think that it's curtailed to your own experience just by virtue of remembering more strongly those things that contributed, to your overall approach.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, here's the time where I got cornered by the zombie with the shotgun and I managed to kill it with a wrench. I only had 3 hit points left, but it had a health thing on it, right? Those user stories of this thing that happened to me, they just support the idea, it's a smoke and mirrors thing, right? The player will believe a lot. And if you only tip the scales a little, that'll still be enough.
Yeah.
More than enough.
Yeah.
Just make those stories more likely. So, well, we've taken up a little over an hour of your time, Ken, and it's been really, really interesting. I feel like I could pick your brain about not only this, but all of your titles for hours. Is there anything you want to specifically talk about, looking ahead?
No, I mean, I think I've spent a lot of time going back to think about not just System Shock 2, but just sort of the period of time when games weren't so packaged for a broad audience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And your conversation about the game sort of, because we talk about that all the time with the new game we're making, because, we are targeting a much more, the kind of people who would play a System Shock rather than the 10 million people who would play a BioShock Infinite or something like that. And it's really interesting both to think about how exciting it is to be able to target this group of people, but also realize that I think I never expected gamers to come back and become more like the gamers we were when we started. I kept thinking it would get further and further away from me as I got older, the kind of things that I came up on. And it's exciting that people still like real challenging games and really complex games. And I didn't really think I'd get the chance to make another game like that again, but it's cool to be able to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great trend.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to have that. I mean, the more people play games, the more types of games we can have when you boil it down.
Yep.
Well, that's fantastic. Tim, you have anything else you want to poke in here?
No. This was a wonderful chat. I really appreciate you coming on, Ken. Thanks for doing it. It makes for a good capper for the first series.
What's the next game you're covering?
We're hitting Hitman 2 next.
Nice.
Something Brett hasn't played. I'm a big Hitman fan, and just the sandbox of those games. And we're trying to choose some games that might be a little bit on the tip of people's tongues because of stuff going on, out there. So with the System Shock news around System Shock 3, that thought this would be good, and then Hitman just came out, and their episodic stuff. So and then we'll take it from there. But that's the next that's the next one.
Yeah, there's a lot of news in the games industry these days too. So we were looking for different possible themes. I mean, there's also, Lionhead is closing, so we looked at, there's a lot of Lionhead sort of influence, and XCOM 2 just came out. Yeah. Maybe some old isometric games. I mean, there's a ton of different interesting games you could look at and see where they came from.
It's a game that I thought it didn't really go anywhere. Like its DNA sort of died out. But a game I loved. Do you remember the Battlezone game that?
That one that came in '99 or whatever. Yeah, that was really quite good.
I'd never seen anything like that, and it was quite a hybrid, right? And
it was RTS-y, and you were having the historic battles on the moon. On
the moon that was hidden
with the Russians.
Oh, it's awesome. Like that world was great, right? The fake war, the war that nobody knew about on the moon between the cosmonauts and the astronauts. Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah, I just read Austin Grossman's third book, which is about the Nixon administration. Only he was fighting Cthulhu. And it reminded me of Battlezone, to be honest, because it's a similar sort of thing where it's like this hidden history of, from the 60s in particular. But, great stuff. So recommend it. Funny and clever.
Great guys.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us. Ken, you can be found at IG Levine, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, on Twitter, and we look forward to hearing announcements from you in the near future. I'm at Brett_Duville, and Tim is?
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
That's right. You can find the podcast at Dev Game Club. You can shoot us email at devgameclub@gmail.com. And, of course, we'd love to hear your feedback there, or you can rate and review us on iTunes. We've had a few of those there, and that's been really encouraging. So thanks to those of you who've done that. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again in a week or two when we talk about Hitman 2. All right? Good night, gentlemen.
Good night.
Thank you, guys. That was fun.
Join me, human.
And we can move.
And we can move together.
Nah.
Hi, Brett here. For those who are trying to play along, we just wanted to let you know that for next time, we'll be playing the first 4 missions of Hitman 2, Silent Assassin. That's from the beginning of the game up through a level called Kirov Park. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time on the Dev Game Club.